Okay, is it on?
Yes, Mike.
Oh, awesome. Well, hello, welcome people from the internet to the 11th Hangout on Air, where we get Google developer experts from around Africa to virtually meet with the community. It's a pretty nice way for us to meet up. We're almost face-to-face, sort of, and we get to geek out together about really, really cool tech topics. So feel free to ask any questions in the live chat if there are any of you out there, and we'll get around to asking or answering them at the end of the show. The video will be made available afterwards on the YouTube channel, and if you want to contact us via Twitter, you can tweet using the hashtag #GoogleAfricaDevs. Hashtag. So on the call, unfortunately, we've got a really light staff tonight. It's Kamoon, Cloud GDE from Johannesburg, and Vivian, the Google Developer Ecosystem Manager from Kenya. And myself, I'm Mike. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a Web Technologies GDE from South Africa, Johannesburg. Okay, so what are we going to do tonight? We're going to discuss the state of progressive web apps. It's a very exciting space at the moment. There are lots of exciting changes. And it really is starting to feel like the year of progressive web apps. So today, we're going to be discussing a little bit of news on the agenda. We were going to talk about progressive enhancement, but unfortunately, Era can't make it, and she sent. We're going to the latest news items, which is Service Worker on iOS, and what works and what doesn't work. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about progressive web apps in Africa and owning the narrative. But I suppose before we get to that point, let's just make sure that we're all on the same page, right? So what are progressive web apps anyway? When we talk about progressive web apps, what we mean is we mean modern web experiences. And we can easily exemplify this with a cheesy acronym, which is FIRE, what it stands for: fast, integrated, reliable, and engaging. And you can talk about those as high-level principles, but it doesn't really give you very much detail. We dig into the individual characteristics of progressive web apps to really understand what they mean. And those characteristics are like progressive, where the application has to work for every user, regardless of which browser they choose. Not a new concept at all. Responsive, it needs to fit any form factor of device, which again is not a new concept. Connectivity independent, so the application needs to be tolerant of low connectivity scenarios, which is somewhat new. It needs to feel app-like because it's engaging and deeply personal to users. It must always be up-to-date and fresh. It needs to be safe and use HTTPS. It needs to be discoverable, so search engines and other robots can find it. It needs to encourage re-engagement using push notifications or otherwise engaging the users. They need to be installable, ideally, so added to the home screen so that the application, this progressive application, exists in the space that the user plays in. And then finally, they need to be easily shareable and linkable so that you can spread them around quite a lot. So if you take a look at it, that's a really wide spectrum of characteristics. And you'll find that most things defined as progressive web apps exhibit some, if not all, of those characteristics. And it's very much like looking at a problem from multiple angles and seeing different perspectives of it. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page as to sort of what it is that we're talking about, let's get on to some news items, because it's been very, very exciting at the moment. So the big one that we're going to be discussing tonight is Safari supporting Service Worker, which alone is a major step forward. And we'll talk a little bit further about that later, as well as post some links at the end of the talk. Secondly, Edge supporting Service Worker, which is brand new. I mean, it was announced 3 days ago, which is amazing. So it's very fresh for the presses. And it's been made available as of the April update for Windows 10. I'm not sure when people who use Windows 10 will get a hold of it. But the important part is that this means that all major evergreen browsers will support Service Worker at the moment. And that's a big thing. It's a big victory. the next piece of news that we're interested in is the Workbox release. Workbox has finally released version 3 of their tool set as well as their library, and it's essentially the spiritual successor of SW Precache, for those of you that don't know. It was particularly stressful for me because they released the newest version about 2 weeks before a talk that I gave. And yeah, that was hair-raising. But it is a really elegant API and a really elegant tool set, and it supports a whole bunch of graceful fallbacks for poorer supported APIs, such as background sync. So check that out. And then the last item, which is also very interesting in the Microsoft space, is that they've pushed their first progressive web apps to the App Store. They've made it very clear over the last 18 months that they intend on supporting progressive web apps on Windows as first-class citizens, but I think they really reinforced this by stating that they're going to put apps on the store and then, actually putting them there, which is pretty cool. Okay, so moving on. Unfortunately, Ira is not here. We're going to talk about Service Worker in Safari to start. So firstly, yay. It feels like we've all been holding our breath for this moment. I know I personally have fielded this question many times in many talks where people are like, yes, but will it work on iOS? And as much as, even though it isn't dominant in an African smartphone market for us, it's still really, really important that it exists on iOS so that businesses feel like they can really commit to building progressive web apps that work across the whole gamut of their user base. So perhaps, if you'll forgive me, going through a little bit of history as to how we got to this point. The first real public signs of life for progressive or service worker in Safari started in August 2017 when the WebKit feature status for service worker was updated to in progress. Live chat, awesome, thank you. Was updated to in progress. Which was a relatively subtle acknowledgement of start of work. But we found the first beta for Service Worker available end of January in 2018, which was really, really soon after they started work on it ostensibly. It ended up being released as a part of iOS 11.3 and then macOS 10.13.4, which I believe landed end of March. So if you, all things considered, it's what, 5 months or so, which is an insane turnaround time from intent to shipping. And I think that shows how important the feature was for them. So if we take a look at it, what works and what doesn't? Because it is a first release of the stuff. So covering the install experience first, the notable difference from Android is that the user has to explicitly choose to install the application, which is very different from Chrome's heuristics on Android, prompting them with an app install banner. There's no App Store approval necessary for installing because it is just a shortcut onto the home page or home screen. But to be clear, you can still submit the progressive web app for inclusion to the store using the same hybrid approach that we used to with Cordova. There's likely to be a whole bunch more movement in the space. I can't believe that that's the final solution. And there's probably going to be some kind of footprint of progressive web apps in the store eventually. Now, the options for the install experience is that you can launch Safari as either a website or in standalone mode, which is relatively standard, but there's some features, some of the formatting options are missing. And to be very, very clear, it uses Safari, not the web view. So there are some limitations around that as well that we'll cover. Moving on, an important point for Service Worker as it acts as this network proxy between the JavaScript frontend and the network stack is Cache API, which is heavily used. The limit is 50 megabytes, which is a lot leaner than you find on Chrome and Android, but it is relatively explicit. And something important to remember is that they've stated very clearly that unused caches will be removed after a few weeks. So whatever that may mean will depend on Safari heuristics. I can recommend that you make sure that your application is incredibly resilient to this and expecting the caches to be removed at any point in time. So perhaps let's talk about some limitations for us. So firstly, it's only Safari. It only works in Safari, not Chrome on iOS or any of the other browsers that are using the web view. there's no app install banner, as we mentioned, which is very different from the standard, and that's something that we're going to have to figure our way around. There's no splash screen support, so that functionality in the manifest isn't there. The hard 50 megabyte limit and aggressive cleanup of files is definitely something that we need to think about going forward and design for, and it might limit our design on both aspects. The full screen and minimal UI is not implemented, only standalone and Safari just launching as a browser. So that's something that we're going to have to think about when building this stuff, that it's probably going to change and it's probably going to come soon. There's some access to features, lower level features that we would expect that isn't there. So Bluetooth beacons, touch and face ID, and ARKit, we don't have any access to, and hopefully that'll come with time. And then any private, so personal and device-oriented information, because it is just a browser sandbox, we don't have in Safari as we would have in Chrome. In-app payments isn't supported, and Siri we have no access to. There are some other notable iOS-oriented issues to remember. So firstly, there's the split screen on iPad support is just not there. The progressive web app will, by definition, only take the full screen. And there's no support for push notifications or badges at the moment, which is a major omission. I know that there's a lot of unhappiness around that. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's no background sync API support for Service Worker. It's something that other browser vendors such as Firefox are also a little bit reticent to implement at the moment. So it's kind of understandable that that's not there. Hopefully there'll be a Workbox degraded support for it. So other bugs, there's some weird bugs ostensibly around theme color. The gestures need to be in the application, so it's not completely app-like, because on Android you can assume that there's a back button that will trigger the browser back, and that doesn't exist on iPhones at all, or on iPads. The icon is not taken from the macOS and iOS specific. The back button, I believe, is iOS specific, if that's what we're talking about. I think the WebKit rendering supports or uses the same engine across both, if I understand it correctly. I don't know if that answers the question. The icon, there's a bug that it takes it from Apple Touch icon in the meta tag rather than the manifest itself, which is incorrect behavior, and they need to change that. And then finally, the icon itself can't be transparent as it can on Android devices. So there are some challenges there with how you then design your icon to have the same experience across both. Inactive progressive web apps don't show a preview of the progressive web app. They just show a white screen and whatever that carousel thingy is that you get on iOS. Then the basically anything that uses the Safari view controller, for example, I believe the Twitter application uses a Safari view controller, will support Service Worker, but it will delete the data and Service Worker registration as soon as the session is closed. And anything that uses the web view, which is, I think, Facebook and Chrome and those kinds of things, doesn't support Service Worker at all. Okay, but it's still a massive positive step forward. And we're just going to have to keep a close eye on this space. I think we're in a much better position for it. Now, the next thing that I'd like to cover, if that's okay, is progressive web apps in Africa. We've heard a lot about the next billion users as a buzzword in a frame. But what does that really mean? And what does it mean to us? And why should we care about this? Well, if we take a look at some numbers, we look at approximately, and this information comes from Internet Statistics, the Internet Statistics website. There are about 4 billion internet users globally, and there are about 400 million internet users in Africa. So we're taking a look at about 10% of internet users exist in Africa. The penetration for that is about 52% globally, approximately on aggregate, of which we get on aggregate about 31% in Africa, which superficially looks like we're bad, but we're not doing too badly, except when you then start comparing ourselves with America and Europe, where Europe sits at approximately 85% web penetration, and America sits, oh, sorry, not America, North America sits at 95% web penetration. So the net result of that is how's it, Prosper? The net result of that is that we're looking at an opportunity. Can we hit mute? Yes, thank you. We're looking at an opportunity of a large body of people who we just don't have access to. When we couple that with more information, specifically mobile, and why this is important from a mobile perspective, and the data that I'm gonna mention is 2016 data. Unfortunately, it's the most recent that I could find, projected forward to 2020. And the 2016 data says that there are about 420 million unique mobile subscribers across Africa, and they're expecting that to increase to about 535 million by 2020, which isn't a massive increase. The one that's important to note, however, is the smartphone data that looks at about 2016, there were 200 million smartphones, and projected by 2020, they're going to be about 500 million smartphones. So a vast majority of our African user base will have devices that have the capability to deal with these features that we need. And when you correlate this with the last interesting statistics, which is the growth of mobile web, of these mobile subscribers, we're at 2016 looking at about 26% of mobile subscribers using the mobile web at all, and the projection is that for 2020 that'll increase to about 38%. I'll try and share these statistics afterwards. So I'm not going to go over the data costs and speed issues because it's far too depressing and far too close to home, I think, for all of us, but we all know that they exist. I think while it's different, specifically from a cost perspective across Africa, it's something that we definitely need to think about, need to actively think about. So what does this mean? What am I trying to get to? What I'm trying to say is that for progressive web apps, the story for progressive web apps is us. We squarely sit within that next billion users. Yes, absolutely right, Jochen. So we squarely sit within that next billion users, and we need to own that narrative. So what I'm asking and what I'm hoping is that this excites us as Africans to go out and get involved and build progressive web apps that address some of these concerns and try and bridge this gap. What I'd really like is to get some real African applications to show off. There's very little local data, and people seem very some of the data that exists. So we'd love to showcase this stuff, we'd love to talk about it, and we'd love to show some real African success stories. I know is it Paystack? I think it's Paystack. I've lost that link now, damn it. Anyway, I'll try and find that link just now of the one that was shared amongst our circles. So if there are any other questions, we can take those questions before we look at a wrap up. Or is there any commentary from the people who have joined? Hello, everybody. No? Okay, awesome. So if that's it, we'll answer questions as they appear. And then barring that, we're going to talk about some of the things that are coming. Obviously, there's a lot of excitement because the big thing is I/O happening next week, which we're super excited about. A bunch of us will be there, and we're definitely expecting a whole bunch more progressive web app news. Ire herself will be recording her whole experience and sharing it via a YouTube channel on the Google Developers YouTube channel. So yeah, we're gonna be there, Africa at I/O, which is great. And we've got a whole bunch of I/O extended events that are going to be happening. I know that there are events on the 8th of May in Joburg and Cape Town at the GDG Joburg and Cape Town that will stream the keynote, so go ahead and attend. And I'm sure that your local meetups, wherever they may be across Africa, will have extended events as well. So the next event that we're going to have, or the next show we're going to have at the end of May, is going to be Google I/O feedback, where we talk about all the shenanigans that we're going to get up to, right? And then thereafter, we're open for ideas. I mean, what do people want? What do people want to hear? So shoot us your idea. Let us know. Again, you can chat to us on hashtag Google Africa Devs, or I think you can at Google Africa. And then, yeah, we'll have further announcements as to other shows and more discussion going forward. So I think that's me, unless anyone has anything to add. Okay.